Coming this afternoon. Welcome to our first R3 of the spring semester. Today we are very lucky to have with us Dr. Kaja Jasinska, who's a cognitive neuroscience. Kaja Jasinska. We've never met in person, only on Skype. So Kaja Jasinska is a cognitive neuroscientist in the Linguistics and Cognitive Science Department at the University of Delaware. She obtained her doctorate from the University of Toronto, completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Haskins Laboratory at Yale, and recently held a Jacobs Foundation Early Career Research Fellowship that supported her work in Cote d'Ivoire. Her work focuses on the neural mechanisms that support language, whether monolingual or bilingual, signed or spoken, reading, and cognitive development across the lifespan. Her research asks questions such as, how does early life experience change the brain's capacity for language and learning? She uses MRI and neuroimaging technology in combination with genetic and behavioral analyses to gain new insights into biological underpinnings of language, reading, and human cognition.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Sorry for getting a bit of a late start. We're trying to figure out the map and the noise version. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that I'm doing using developmental neuroscience for literacy interventions, but particularly in places where illiteracy rates are really, really high. So ensuring that all kids learn to read, and really everyone learns to read, is one of our sustainable development goals, goal 4.6 to be exact. And I want to show you that we can use developmental science to help and support learning across diverse contexts to realize this goal. So thinking with a kind of very global mindset throughout the talk. So how does a child learn to read? How do we get from language right into literacy? How does that child crack the code? So today I want to review this in 3 parts. So first I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the work I've done and others to establish the neural systems that support language and make reading possible. Next, what are the different environmental impacts on that reading trajectory, specifically through the lens of kids learning to read multiple languages, becoming biliterate, or learning to read in their second language, as well as kids that are growing up in environments that have risk of illiteracy. And then lastly, how we can use these tools of developmental or educational neuroscience to inform our literacy interventions. So first and foremost, reading has a neurobiological foundation. There are genes that are related to the structure and function of the brain, and these are regions that underpin learning. So this is the kind of framework that I'm thinking about. But of course, this complex relationship between the biology, the brain, and children's learning is what happens in an environment, right? So it's highly influenced by what's going on in your family, what languages you're listening to or exposed to, what's happening in your classroom, what languages you're learning in, and your community as a whole. So there are complex relationships between all of these domains that we're really only beginning to understand. So I'm going to start off reviewing some of these neural systems for language and reading. And I know in this audience at FSU, this is probably all old hat to you all. But of course, we know that there's a typical developmental trajectory for reading. Kids start off as pre-readers before moving on to emergent literacy, where they're really sounding words out letter by letter, before finally arriving at skilled and fluent reading. Now, before a child even begins to learn to read, they're already a proficient user of their spoken language, right? So what that means is they know the relationship between phonology and semantics, right? Sound and reading. That's very already set up for that child. And when you're coming to learn to read, you're adding in this new ingredient, the orthography, the writing system of the language. And so early on, kids are cracking this code of mapping letters onto sounds by really sounding words out letter by letter. And this is very much supported by their phonological skills, namely phonological awareness. So this awareness of and ability to manipulate the sound units of their language. And over time, the relationship between orthography and semantics comes to becomes more automated. So kids, rather than relying on this more heavily phonologically mediated route into literacy, they tend to just recognize words with more automaticity. This view of reading is really characterized by a series of models called triangle models of reading that define this process as a series of distributed, processes over the domains of orthography, phonology, and semantics. Now, reading has also a characteristic neurodevelopmental trajectory. And this is characterized by a largely left hemisphere network that supports reading. comprised of regions that are kind of key hubs to this region network, like the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is associated with things like lexical access, among others. Superior temporal gyrus, that's known for its role in phonological processing. Supramarginal gyrus, that's very involved in mapping letters with sounds, visual word form areas, and others. And over time, the networks that already exist for language come to overlap very much with these new networks that will process printed language or process reading. And this degree of overlap between the two is actually a really reliable predictor of how well the child will learn to read. So I want to show you a little bit of the work that we've been doing. This is kind of some of the work I did while I was a postdoc at Haskins, so kind of that Haskins tradition of studying the science of the spoken and written word. That's their motto, and moving forward. So even before kids start learning to read, what's that pre-literate brain look like? And does that tell us something about a child's future reading ability? So in this study, oh, and sorry about the little, sometimes when you migrate from Mac to PC, you get the little words don't all fall in the same line. So I promise you I'm like obsessive about the words. I'm not snappy, except in this case. So, I'm also going to put up details of any studies that I talk about in this gray box, just because, you know, for giving you a broader picture rather than getting into the nitty gritty, but do ask me some questions. So this was a study we did actually using functional near-infrared spectroscopy, neuroimaging. Now, fNIRS, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this, is very much like fMRI, measures the brain's hemodynamic response, but it does so using lights, and it's particularly child-friendly technique, and this is what we've been using at Haskins, what I have in my lab, and actually what I worked as a doctoral student as well. So this was a neuroimaging study where we had pre-readers that were about 4 and 5 years old, and older emergent readers who were 6 and 7. And they listened to and read words and pseudo words. Now, our pre-readers only did the listening portion of this task because, you know, they're not yet reading, so we didn't ask them to do any reading tasks. And I'm going to tell you what we found. So for these pre-readers, our 4 and 5-year-olds, for listening to words, they show a really nice canonical, actually bilateral STG response for speech. No big surprise here. We know this is a region that does this. So great. But then we have the same task, the speech processing task with the emergent readers, and these kids actually show more activity for the same task, like the same words, right? They're showing greater activity in the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is kind of interesting. And if we look at what these emergent readers are doing when they're actually reading, they're showing this kind of IFG activity as well, right? So the network for speech and the network for print starts to look alike. And we see that how the brain processes spoken language, in fact, changes over a child's development, but it changes also in response to reading experience. So that was the first thing that we noticed. And then we wanted to find out, okay, well, these pre-readers, is there anything about this pre-literate brain that could tell us something about how a child will come to learn to read later on? So we took that same group of kids and we followed them for 1 year. So now we have time to, a year later, where they're emergent readers, and we're using that same kind of NIRS task. So at time 1, you're seeing the same task. And at time 2, we're looking at their CTOB and Woodcock-Johnson different language and reading battery scores. So what we did here actually was do an analysis called psychophysiological interaction analyses. We wanted to understand how the different regions that make up the reading brain kind of connect with each other and how they communicate. So PPI is an analysis that basically tells you which regions become better connected in response to certain conditions. So let's say listening to language. And what we found was there was greater connectivity between left and right hemisphere STG and IFG. And here's the cool part about this, right? We did this showing you the results of a stepwise regression where we're looking at all sorts of demographic, linguistic, and neural, and as well as connectivity predictors of letter word decoding 1 year later. And of course, our child's language abilities like phonological awareness at time 1 predict reading time 2. No big surprises there. But what was really interesting to us was the connectivity between the brain regions that predicts future reading ability, not just the brain activity overall. So it's not about how much activity do you have in these brain regions, it's about how do these brain regions talk to each other. And that got us thinking about this interactive specialization theory of cognition, right? Complex cognitive skills like reading emerge from the connections that different brain regions come to form. And that happens in response to maybe some inherent processing biases of certain pathways like the SDGs for spoken language, but also in response to experience, right? So over time, an optimal network is going to emerge by the strengthening of these pathways. So it's the pathways that actually predict the child's future reading outcome. Okay, so now we've got these emergent readers. How do they become skilled? So in the next study is again an FNER's neuroimaging study. But now we've got a group of kids that's a little bit older. So we've got our 6 to 8 year old cohort, and now we've got 9 and 10 year olds. We had kids read regularly spelled words, irregularly spelled words, and pseudo words. Now the difference between the regularly and irregularly spelled words, one has very predictable letter to sound mapping, and the other one doesn't. And what we find is for our emergent readers, that I'm showing you a map of brain activity while reading irregular, greater than while reading these regular word types. And our emergent readers, they don't show much of a difference between these two word types, right? A little bit, and actually the little bit that they do show is in the supramarginal gyrus, which we know is associated with letter sound mapping. Interesting. But once kids become skilled readers, for this particular irregular word type, in comparison to the regular word type, they show more activity in the left inferior frontal gyrus. Now this is really interesting, right? Because regular words can be sounded out letter by letter, so they can really depend more on phonological processing. But an irregular word, one cannot do that, right? So it favors direct lexical access, and this is what we're seeing. So we're seeing a focal brain correlate of a developmental reading milestone with a shift in neural recruitment for reading that happens with this acquisition of reading skill. Okay. I'm talking so fast, I'm going to take a while. But of course, right, the question for all of us should be, to what extent is this trajectory universal? This is great for English. Wonderful. Not everybody's learning to read in English, right? Kids don't know what language they might come to learn, what languages, plural, they might come to learn, or what they might be reading in. So to what extent does a child's language environment shape this trajectory? And so this is what I'm going to review in a couple slides before moving on to the big part of the talk. Now, bilingualism and biliteracy is sort of a wonderful lens into the role of experience in shaping language and reading development. Because monolingual, bilingual kids, while they do differ on many things, they differ most on language experience. And for the most part, they're quite comparable, particularly in some of these kids that we studied were in Canada, so there's less SES confounds among the monolingual, bilingual kids in Toronto where the studies were done. Right, so we could look at things like to what extent do cross-linguistic differences between a bilingual's two languages shape reading, and what about the age at which kids come to acquire, or the age at which these kids are exposed to that second language. Okay, so we did a study, actually, this is a big study we did in Toronto. I mean, big for our psychologists because it had 400 kids in it, but not for like an education audience. We do many more than that. So this was a big study we did in Toronto, actually, where we compared emergent and skilled readers, so first through to the 4th grade, learning to read, and we had 4 groups, so bear with me. These groups are kind of complex. We have our English monolinguals, nice and easy. Then we have early bilinguals. These are kids that are exposed to English and some other language from birth. Again, this is Toronto, so there was tons of language lines available to us. Then we had late French bilinguals, so these were effectively English monolinguals that then went into French immersion schools in Toronto, which we have there. And late English bilinguals, who were speaking some other language at home and then started learning English when they got to school. So we had this early and late exposure contrast built in. We looked at these kids' phonological awareness, vocabulary, and their regular and irregular word reading, right? So predominantly I'm concerned with these kind of reliable, robust predictors of literacy and literacy outcomes across word reading. And I'll tell you just very quickly, our early exposed bilinguals outperform our monolinguals. They just do better on the measures of phonological awareness and reading, really reliably so. And even our late English bilinguals, so these were kids that started learning English even until they got to school. By 4th grade, they're statistically indistinguishable from the rest of the group. So great. But here's the cool part about the study. We did the structural equation model where we wanted to understand these kind of routes into literacy. How does phonological awareness support or predict reading? How does semantic knowledge or vocabulary predict reading? What we find in the monolinguals is very much when we lump that whole group together, phonological awareness and vocabulary knowledge predicts reading. No big surprises for us here. But if we look at the early exposed bilinguals, this changes, right? So for our kids who are exposed to 2 languages from birth, the predictive relationship between phonological awareness and reading is really strong. That's not to say vocabulary is no longer important. It still is, significantly so, but to a lesser degree. And if we flip this around for our later exposed bilinguals, it's in fact the reverse pattern, right? So for a child who's learning to read in their second language, they're relying less on phonological awareness, much more so on vocabulary knowledge, which was interesting to us. And it suggests that bilingualism and that age of bilingual exposure even impacts the routes into literacy. So an educator might consider this in terms of who's in their classroom and what kind of educational approaches they might use to better support a certain set of skills or others, depending on that child's background. Okay, I'm going to tell you about one more study here in this kind of vein. We wanted to, we've got these monolinguals, we've got these bilinguals, and we sort of threw all the bilingual kids into one pot and we just said, hey, it doesn't matter what the other language is, we're just counting you as a bilingual. So we got a little bit systematic about this. We wanted to figure out whether there was something about that child's other language, the linguistic features, the writing system of that language, that might actually shape some of these processes. So we looked at kids that were skilled readers, we had English monolinguals, French English bilinguals, exposed from birth, right? So there's no age of acquisition effects here whatsoever. Everyone's exposed to both languages from birth. And then Spanish English bilinguals, and they did that F-Mears task, my pet F-Mears task where they read irregular, and pseudo words. This is what I do. And the reason why we made these different language pairings is because they differ in orthographic depth, right? So what that means, English we know has a really unpredictable or pretty unpredictable relationship between letter and sound in comparison to French and in comparison to Spanish. Spanish is a very transparent or kind of meaning words sound exactly how they look. French is a bit odd in that depending on whether you're going from phonology to orthography or orthography to phonology, that relationship is not consistent. So it's sort of somewhere in the middle, but for reading, it's much more transparent compared to English. Okay, so here's what we find when we have these kids doing this, reading these regular and irregulars and the brain result. For one, in terms of accuracy, no differences for regular word types across these 3 groups. But for the irregular words, only the Spanish English bilinguals show lower accuracy. Again, right, they're reading in English, but Spanish is this really predictable letter to sound mapping. English doesn't, so potentially that might impact and impede the irregular reading in English. But we actually see this in the brain as well. So for the English monolinguals, I'm showing you again that irregular versus regular contrast. You see this nice LIFG activity, but for the Spanish group in English, for the same contrast, they're recruiting more of the STG, which is a region of the brain associated with phonological processing. So these word types, they differentially recruit the IFG and STG. And what we're really seeing is an impact of language typology on reading. Okay, moving onwards, right? English, French, Spanish, that's really nice. But this is the linguistic map of Sub-Saharan Africa, right? We can't really talk about multilingual or bilingualism and literacy without considering that the places where we tend to work and the types of languages we tend to study really underestimate the variety, the variance that exists out there. So, when have you found yourself learning to read in this context? Does that shape this process? So we actually did some work in Kenya. And Kenya is bilingual education, so kids are learning to read in Swahili and in English. Swahili is like Spanish, it's very transparent. English, again, is opaque. And this was a study with, there was over 1,200 kids that we followed. And these kids came from different language groups. They were Swahili speakers, so first language Swahili, they're going to school learning to read in Swahili and English. Kamba speakers, so first language Kamba, then learning to read in English Swahili, their second and third language. And a group of kids speaking a group of languages called the Mijikenda group. And again, they're like the Kamba, they are learning to read in their second and third language. And we measured phonological awareness, perceptive vocabulary, and word reading. So here's what we find in this group? Oh, before I get there. So I want to tell you this thing, right? So I'm talking about how important phonology is for learning to read. We all know this. And Mijikenda and Swahili really overlap in their phonological systems. So what I mean by that is we did like a linguistic analysis and we found that the phonemes that make up Mijikenda and Swahili were really similar. The phonotactic rules were similar. Their syllable structures were similar. Whereas Kamba and Swahili, still similar, but there was really a nice difference between the two. So we thought, given this important role of phonology in learning to read, would the degree of phonological similarity between your first language and the language of literacy potentially impact this? And it turns out that it did, because for these Mijikenda kids who share so much phonology with Swahili, they were showing greater reliance on phonological awareness, whereas the Kamba kids were showing greater reliance on receptive vocabulary. Second thing we found was phonological awareness and receptive vocab. They differentially predict reading depending on whether you're learning to read in Swahili or in English. So for Swahili, phonological awareness was much more predictive than it was for English. There we go. So based on these orthographic depth, right, there's this interaction between orthographic depth and the shared cross-linguistic features between the L1 and the language of literacy that impacts how these kids learn to read. This is where we learn to read, right? The journey of the literacy takes place in the classroom. Kind of looks like exactly the room I'm in without the colorful posters, right? But the reality is the journey of the literacy really looks like this, right? When kids are learning to read in overcrowded classrooms with little resources, where kids of all ages in one place, learning to read maybe in a language they don't even speak at home or in the community. So this is really another type of environmental impact on literacy. We've seen that this role that bilingualism has, but what if we kind of scale this up and think about these highly multilingual contexts with these additional complex variables? And really, we have a literacy crisis. I don't know what else to call it but this, because we look at the map of literacy in the world. And clearly, the cause and the consequence of this is poverty, because the two maps are almost perfectly correlated, right? And then it's almost, you could just swap them out one for the other. So what if you find yourself learning to read in an environment that is impoverished, that carries with it a higher risk of illiteracy? Say in the absence of access to quality education, in a new language, right? We've seen from that linguistic map of Sub-Saharan Africa, lots of kids might be learning to read in a language they don't speak at home, and that's really the case for most kids at different ages, right? In some of the first grade classrooms I visited, or I collect data, we have kids between 4 and 10 in one first grade classroom. So are they learning to read in the same way? And without adequate family and community literacy resources to support them. So we've been trying to answer these questions in Ivory Coast. So let's tell you a little bit about this country. Its literacy rate is like 50, I think now it's about 58%. So it's really low youth literacy rate from 15 to 24. Primary school enrollment has continued to increase. But even if kids are enrolled, that doesn't mean they're attending regularly, and that's a big problem. And there's still conservatively 800,000 children that are not enrolled at all in school. So if the kids aren't attending school regularly, or if they're not enrolled altogether, where are the kids, right? Well, I don't know if you know, but Ivory Coast has a huge problem, or a substantial problem, with child labor and cocoa agriculture. So lots of kids are actually working in cocoa. Ivory Coast is responsible for more than 40% of the world's global cocoa production. Cocoa farmer income is below the poverty line, and there's an estimated 1.4 million Ivorian children between 5 and 14 that are working in child labor. And that includes doing hazardous work. So unfortunately, this is in French because it's a picture of a photo I took of a poster I saw at one of the schools. So hazardous work includes things like carrying heavy loads, using sharp objects, tools to cut trees, burning the trees, or putting on like chemical pesticide and things of that sort. Here's another picture I took in one of my field sites just outside the village, where you can see a boy. He's wearing his gumboots, so very clearly going to the field, and on top of his head he's got this little backpack. Just everybody pretty much carries things on their head, so he's got this backpack that has a spray nozzle, and that's how pesticides are distributed on the plantation. So how does a child learn to read in this type of environment with this high risk of illiteracy? Is really a question of how the brain does it, right? Is reading, that trajectory I showed you, is it just delayed? Do we take that exact same thing that I've shown you from like 4 to 10 and we just move it up and then the process unravels in the analogous manner? Or is it somehow different, right? Potentially so, because you know, a 10-year-old learning to read might not be the same as a 6-year-old learning to read. A 10-year-old's brain is much more developed, much more mature than a 6-year-old's. There are measurable differences between the two and lots of their capacity. So by sending kids actually growing up in this kind of context who might be starting school late or might be exposed to literacy very sporadically, we're poised to answer some really important theoretical questions about the role of experience and the age at which we get access to education and how reading actually happens. And at the same time, it's really practically relevant, right? Because if we know something about how a 10-year-old learns to read for the first time, then maybe we could think a little bit better about what we should be doing in that classroom or in terms of intervention to support that child. And so that's what we're trying to do, right? So thus far, we're assuming that literacy happens somewhere between, say, 4 and 10, maybe for those stages I told you a little bit about. Now, the first formal literacy exposure in high-income countries like ours, probably around the first grade. But first formal literacy exposure in low and middle income countries can be much later, and it can be very sporadic on top of that. Okay. So in Ivory Coast, here's what we did. So we've been working in these 4 sites across the country, and in our first study that we were doing there, we collected data from 800 kids. They were between 4 and 14 in first, third, and fifth grade. And these kids did a whole language and reading cognitive battery where we measured their French language and literacy. We also measured their local language. Actually, Ivory Coast is something like 70 languages spoken, but we developed a language assessment toolkit for 4 out of those 70 languages, because we know about the important role of that first language in reading acquisition, and there was nothing there to measure that child's first language. We're really only measuring their second language proficiency. So that was one of the things that my team did. We worked with some linguists at the Institut Linguistique Appliquée in the university there to do that. And of course, we had our extensive questionnaire about the child's home school and other environment, and that well-known FNIRS language and reading task that you now see. Okay, and that's one of the RAs that's one of the since this is my grad student, now postdoc, actually, Fabrice, doing one of these literacy assessments with the kids. So I'm only going to show you like a subset of the findings, otherwise we'd be here for 3 days talking about this, which is what I'm currently doing with Jakob for like 2 days, just talking about this stuff. So in our letter, word, and pseudo-word reading task, this is based off the EGRA, the early grade reading assessment. Kids had 100 letters to read, 50 words, and 50 pseudo-words. These were the results by first, third, and fifth grade. So fifth graders, the average letter reading score out of 100 letters is 28 in fifth grade. In 1 minute, most fifth graders can, on average, get 28. It's an immensely positively skewed data set, which means a lot of these kids just have 0 scores. Imagine being in fifth grade and you don't yet know your letter sounds, right? That's the reality here. And for words and pseudo words, it's even less. So we did some models to try to understand what predicted the reading outcomes for these kids. And first and foremost, we found that those kids that reported doing hazardous labor, which was in this sample was about 50% of the kids reported working on a cocoa plantation. Of those kids, about 70 reported at least one of those forms of hazardous labor, which is actually really consistent with other figures that have been reported. These kids have poor reading outcomes, and hazardous labor is even higher in households that are lower SES. The other thing that we found was that reading is still really much driven by phonological awareness, and that the local language really does matter, right? So French phonological awareness predicts French reading. There's no surprises there. But local language phonological awareness does so above and beyond the variants already explained by French PA. So I tell you a little bit about this. So the phonological awareness in the local language, we actually broke this out by kids that started school early, on time, and late. So the kids that are starting late are a little bit, they're poor, but not significantly so. But their kids who are starting school late, their French phonological awareness is poor, right? It makes sense if you are speaking some other language at home, and the age at which you start school really corresponds to the age at which you first start learning French. Of course, those skills might not be as good as they could be. And so my grad student, Jo, has been actually looking at this, and she's been looking at the fifth graders more specifically, and she's kind of broken out some of these key predictors of reading. So for phonological awareness, kids that are younger in fifth grade, which means they started school on time, versus kids that are older in fifth grade, meaning they started school late. There's a really big difference between their phonological awareness skills, but not in their vocabulary, right? So this one thing is kind of compromised by age of school start. Yes, so age and the age of school start really affects phonological awareness, but not vocabulary. And if we look at reading outcomes across this letter, word, and non-word tasks, they just get poorer the older you are. So it's kind of a reverse relationship what we normally find. We expect older kids to be better readers, but in our sample, our older kids are actually worse readers. And our older kids tend to start school later. And so that we think is the mechanism. So these two things are always obviously very related, so we can't quite untangle age and age of school start because they highly correlated variables, but this is the relationship that we find. Okay, so these older children are poor readers, but they're also the ones that start school late. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about, I've been telling you before about this networks for language and networks for reading. So we wanted to understand this in this context as well. So what we did is we show up at the school. We work with many schools there. So this is the little Ivorian flag in the courtyard. This is how the typical school building looks like. And then my team builds the laboratory. This is our state-of-the-art cognitive neuroscience, neuroimaging laboratory for the field. There's no electricity, there's no running water, there's no such thing as a quiet testing room. It does not exist. And then you have, there's Fabrice again and my former grad students, so Sten, who are setting up one of our kits, and we have FNIR's paradigm up and running. So what do we find? Okay, so we took these fifth graders, right? So we didn't do the whole lot of kids. Fifth graders, about 50 of them. And these kids were about 10, 11 years old. And we divided these kids out based on how they did on that letter task. They could read a little bit, so they got somewhere between 10 and 40% right on that letter task. We counted these kids out to poorer readers and those that got about 60% as strong readers. So it's a pretty even split. And we had kids listen and read words, pseudo words, and false fonts. And I'm just realizing that in the conversion from Mac to New Thing, the false font still looks like a regular. So false font is just squiggles. It looks like it has all the visual features of a regular font, but none of the orthography, knowledge, or semantics, obviously. And let's see. I had sounds for you playing where you could hear the words, the pseudo words, and the low coded speech that we use, but that's okay. So here's what we found. We divided these kids out, stronger and poor readers, and we looked at the word versus false font comparison, right? So words have the orthography, the phonology, the semantics. False fonts, they have just the visual features, they're just the visual equivalent, but they don't have any of that meaningful information. So for our stronger readers, we see this really nice characteristic reading network down in the left hemisphere, engaging like S to G and I to G. Really kind of straightforward. I'm really sorry that the plots are running into each other. We also actually found a nice impact of SES on activity, particularly in the IFG, right? So we looked at the brain activity in these kids and we wanted to know, is there any impact of SES on activity here? And the only thing we found was in the prefrontal cortex, and particularly for print, there was this effect of SES. Now, the prefrontal cortex is one of the latest maturing regions, or the latest maturing region of the brain, right? So it remains open and vulnerable to the effects of the environment for a much longer period of time, which is why we think we see this impact in our kids that are now 10 and 11 years old. And this is actually something that my other grad student, Axel, and research associate in my lab, Ben Zinger, were working on. So they were like, okay, prefrontal cortex, this is something that quite important for executive function. So Axel started modeling these relationships between SES, executive functions, and letter reading. And what he's finding is that executive functions are particularly vulnerable to the effects of SES. And in turn, this low SES and poor executive functions negatively impact literacy. So coming back to this, the other side of here is the poor readers. So what I'm showing you here is the greater brain activity for false fonts compared to words. Right? Because actually for this group of poor readers, we didn't find at all in our results any greater activity for actual words compared to false ones. Their brains show more activity for the false ones compared to words, which is a little interesting. It indicates to me a lack of sensitivity to the lexicality of words. And here's the thing. These kids don't look like kids that have dyslexia, right? In a completely unrelated study, just from the literature, I thought where they have a word versus false font contrast again, so it's the same kind of task, 11 years old, so same age as these kids, right? If you look at our control, typically developing kids, they show nice activity in the LIFG for reading, exactly like our strong readers. But the dyslexic kids, well, they still show activity in the left IFG for words compared to false fonts. It's just a little bit more diffuse. They engage more of the right hemisphere. This is that characteristic dyslexia pattern, right? Our kids don't look like this, right? None of these kids show more activity for false fonts compared to words in the IFG. The other thing that's interesting is our pattern of results also doesn't look like neural activity for pre-readers, so kids that are not yet reading, who could be, one could make the case that they're at the same kind of skill level. So this is a completely different study. They've actually been 10 years apart, completely different authors. The color coding doesn't mean the same thing, so you can sort of scrap the green, yellow, green, red on the left-hand side. So on this new figure, I want you to look at the red activity. That indicates greater activation for false fonts compared to words, right? So false fonts versus words is in green here, and for our younger readers, it's in red at the end. It's in the same brain region. Again, not in the brain region that my worrying kids are showing this pattern that are much older. So this kind of leads us to the question of why. Like, what is this pattern about? Where is this coming from? And this is what my lab is kind of stuck on these days. We're trying to figure this out, but we started collecting more data to see if this really holds true or if this was maybe something of a fluke. And it kind of brings me back to this interactive specialization theory that I mentioned earlier, right? So we know that this reading network emerges in response to experience, right? At least it expects or it requires this experience in order to form. So what if you've just not been getting that experience until you get to school a little bit later, even if it's by a few years, 3 years or something to that effect? Could that indicate some sensitive periods for literacy, right? So the way by which you learn to read actually might change if the process is now delayed. Okay, so here's what we did next, right? We have this outstanding question. If you haven't had the experience, is that what's withholding you from developing this kind of canonical pattern that we associate with reading? So we say, well, what if we just give the experience? Let's give the experience, let's see what happens. Let's see if we can remediate this network, or if this network changes in response to that experience for these older kids. So this is what we did next. We developed an intervention that would support children's reading acquisition, particularly using what we've already found, but at the same time get at this question of why is this network the way it is. So the idea is really to leverage research findings to design, test, and scale solutions, but simultaneously address some of these critical, outstanding questions. So here's what we know. Illiteracy is expensive, right? And basic formal schooling has failed to achieve literacy for many of these kids. They're 5th grade and they're not reading anywhere near. They've got 1 more year of primary school, probably not going to go on to secondary school for a number of systematic reasons that we can get into. So there's really kind of an urgency to this. And we know that's because of poor school attendance, poor school quality, and parents often not even being engaged in education. So we wanted to know, can we improve decoding skills for these older illiterate children? And can we do this in a way that's scalable, right? It's not good enough if we can improve literacy for 100 kids or in one school or just one village. We really wanted something that would work. So we developed a home-based phone literacy curriculum called Allo Alphabet. This is something that I built with an ed tech company that's based out of Kenya in partnership with a colleague at CMU's Human-Computer Interaction Institute. So we gave a simple mobile phone to each child, right? Dumb phone, not smartphone. Smartphones are expensive. They need data. They're very complex for this setting. We built in ways to engage the parents by having them involved in trainings and parent modules into the technology, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about. Okay, so what is this Allo Alphabet? Well, we designed this to be informed by science, both what we found in the field and what we know about literacy development in the first place. Kids use this at home rather than at school because lots of them weren't going to school. So they're spending time on the plantation. So we wanted something that was going to be available to them. So they actually use this in the evenings, once they're no longer working. It's a simple phone rather than smartphone. Smartphones and tablets and data is expensive. It's not going to work. And then all of our feasibility work and the questionnaires we did and interviews with parents really showed us that a smartphone was also, most importantly, culturally completely inappropriate. Parents were not okay with giving the most expensive item they would own in that household to one of the youngest members of the family. It doesn't make sense. It is not a viable solution for this context. We leverage the child's first language, right? Knowing the important role of phonology, knowing that the local language phonology supports reading, we built out this content to actually use this phonological structure of the child's first language, which is Ati in this case, as a bootstrap into French literacy. So what does that mean? So kids are exposed to content that, as they first start in the program, they're French words, but they could be Ati words, right? So they have the same phonemes, phonotactic rules, and syllable structures. So we start out with things that are kind of familiar and part of the L1 as this bootstrap. It's adaptive. So we keep track of how kids respond to the questions and increase or decrease the difficulty level to kind of keep them in that sweet spot where they're challenged, sufficiently challenged, but not too challenged. It targets the appropriate skill level, which is decoding in this case. When I started developing this program with Aneza, we got together, we started brainstorming about some ideas on what we could come together to do. And Aneza said, I will never forget this in the meeting, said, we will text the children short stories. They will read the stories over text messaging, and they will answer comprehension questions because it's fifth grade. While yes, that officially is the fifth grade curriculum for Côte d'Ivoire, it is so far from the reality of what the kids needed at the time that it really kind of highlighted this mismatch between what sometimes we're thinking about and what the reality is without actually going to these places and getting this data. And we have a parent module to track child progress. So parents call in and they get information about how their kids are doing. And the critical thing about this is it doesn't require the parent to be literate, which is the majority of the parents. So what are these kids doing? Well, it's like when you call Verizon, it says press 1 for, I'm like writing it. Okay. It's press 1 for, English and press 2 for Spanish or whatever it might be. That same system called IVR, that's what we've used. We've bridged that with just SMS. So kids kind of phone in and they're on speakerphone and they get questions like, what word starts with pa, pan, sha, lak, right? So press 1 for pan, so press 2 for sha, and things of that sort. So sort of interacting with this. And then we incorporate the SMS content. So a later question might be like, what word starts with pa, but now you get a text message showing you the 3 words, and now you have to press in response, right? So it's really, we've tried to make it work with the most limited technology because tablets and smartphones were never going to work in this context. So I'm actually really quite pleased with us for doing this. So we got 1,200 kids in this study. They're doing that same battery I've shown you guys already, the FNIRS task. We did a phase 1 last year. And we found that the kids, this is actually work that graduate student that works with my colleague Michael Saylor is doing. So he wants to understand the usage patterns. So turns out that the kids who make more calls and answer more questions, the kids that make more calls answer more questions correctly on their first attempt. But again, we can't say much about the directionality. Maybe kids that are really good just tend to call more. But over 15 weeks, when we did this first phase 1, kids continued to use the program, right? So, and they did so even when there was a teacher strike. So if you add comparison, Easter holidays where kids are out of school, usage totally dropped off. But teacher strike, when kids were out of school, also the usage kind of it held on. So that was like a really kind of positive indicator to us because guess what? There's another teacher strike this year in Côte d'Ivoire because the technology has to work for the context it's designed for, right? If it's a place where teacher strikes are frequent, it's got to work with that. Okay, so now we've done, we're doing our phase 2. Now we've got the full 1,200 kids in this study. We've collected baseline data. We've got the phone distributions. Now we're going to wait for our midline and our end line. So you have to kind of check in with me when June when I can tell you whether the intervention really worked or not. But here's the thing, right? Normally in an impact evaluation, we run an intervention, we have an RCT, we have a control group, we have a treatment group, and we ask this question, did it work, yes or no, right? We just compare the two. And that's what we find out. But wouldn't it be more powerful to know why it worked, why it didn't, why it worked for some kids and not others? Or what we should do when we come back to the drawing board, because inevitably something's going to work the first time we try something out. And that's where I'm bringing in the neuroscience piece of this. So we've added in pre and post neuroimaging to these kids in this study, so we can see from the theoretical side, is that network changing in the ways that we predict or expect? And also, if not, what? Or what about that network might be changing that can reveal to us the mechanisms by which we get there? Okay, so I'm going to skip. I was going to tell you 3 minutes about this other project, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead of that. I'm just going to tell you we're running this giant cash transfer study where we're actually giving families money and tracking their kids' outcomes, and running in tandem with that an educational intervention called Teaching at the Right Level with a tech-supported piece. So if you have questions about that or is interested, please talk to me. But I'm gonna skip these slides because we have to wrap up. Okay. I want to like share like some final thoughts and take home that I think are really important. There is a tremendous mismatch between where science happens and where science is needed most, right? This is the distribution of scientists per million inhabitants in the world, right? This is the map of illiteracy. Like clearly there's something that's not right here. And so there's an opportunity to build science capacity to address this mismatch. And I think that's very important because diversity in science makes for better science. It just does. So things like training Ivorian neuroscientists, and this is why I'm so happy to be here because you're doing some of these things. Bringing scientists here to study and do these laboratory exchanges, support conference attendance, advanced training, leadership, all of these things. We can build that into the type of work we do internationally to simultaneously be thinking about these issues and doing something about it. But there's more to be done. And sometimes that also means working with the policymakers, right, in a meaningful way. So this is the director of the cabinet, cabinet director of the Ministry of Education in Cote d'Ivoire, Raoul Kone. Raoul said to me, okay, what is this neuroscience stuff? Bring it here, I want to see it, bring it to the ministry offices. So we went with the FNIRs over Thanksgiving, actually 2 years ago. And we set up like a giant auditorium, like, I don't know, 100 people or something like that from the, from the government people. And we said, oh, do you want to try it out yourself? So he went up on stage. It was actually on stage. Oh, my Apple Watch wants to talk to me. So he went up on stage, we put the cap on there. There's Fabrice again, Josiane Eraman, two of the former researcher and current postdoc that are working with me. And we projected Raoul's brain activity like on a big screen for everybody to see. So it's the first time that a politician has undergone public neuroimaging, which I think is kind of fun. Well, it's a charming, fun story to tell you about, but it really kind of stands in for something bigger, right? There's no reason why the educational leadership and the scientists in low and middle income countries cannot be at the forefront of defining what educational neuroscience is all about, particularly given the challenges that are there. And this is one of the ways that we get that conversation going. It starts from even, showing each other what, our tools and figuring out what's available. And this is the second problem, right? This is where neuroscience happens. That's the University of Delaware where I am. This is a map of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia where I live. And that's somebody else's lab because I just don't have time to take pictures of my own laboratory with an FNIRS lab at Yale that I used to work in, right? This is where science happens. It's like exclusively limited to this context. And this really creates a lot of barriers to an inclusive and comprehensive science of the human brain. Right? Neuroscience is weird. It's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. But the human brain isn't, right? And this demand for new knowledge and innovative approaches and solutions is also not weird. So there's something to be thinking about and doing something about. Okay, and I'm gonna end with that. I talked so fast, but I got a late start. I have so many collaborators that I just need to thank, and also lots of the earlier studies I showed you about. I've been very fortunate to have been funded by a number of different groups, including the US and in Canada. And then for the Cote d'Ivoire research, funding from the Yakos Foundation, UBS, Tony Chocolonely, might be the only person that has a grant from a chocolate company, SRCD, and my amazing Ivorian team. Of course, the kids, and I'll just leave you with the lovely video while you ask me some questions. Thank you.
So how do the kids react when you show up with one of those caps in a rural school and say, I'm going to put this on your head and look at your brain?
Right.
How does that go over?
So here's what we do. We have an informed consent procedure for this. First, we don't do parent consent for any part of the study because community consent is what matters. So we go to the chief. We ask the chief and the elders of the community for the meeting. We ask, we do this in a traditional way. We ask the chief for the benediction of the ancestors. If the ancestors say we are allowed to be there, we are there. Also, you have to note that my team is mostly Ivorian. It's 99%. It's me and maybe sometimes one of my grad students pops by, but I don't want this to be an outsider group coming in. So I'm trying to be very sensitive of that. So there's not such a what's happening to me because it's not a kind of this outsider group. So we get the blessings from the chiefs. The chiefs have been very, very, very supportive. They're really great to work with. We get the support of the parent-teacher group. And the kids, we show as we do any study, like we do assent with them. If they like it, if they don't want it, they get to see it. They're always very excited to participate. And we have this little, we have to digitize with like a 3D digitizer the positions on the head. So basically taking a little stylus and tapping the different points. And then one time we caught the kids playing that, like on the side. So they were like, okay, you're going to be, and I'm going to digitize your head. So they took a stick and they're like, and he's like, oh no, you have to touch the ear and the nose first, whatever it was. So we've had really good kind of community buy-in, but I think that's because we've tried to go about this not in our model of informed consent and not in our model of how it works, but in a model that's very much like I just came to my team and I said, what are the things to consider and how should we do this? So we actually get a really, really nice response. And then, parents pop by to just come and see things and they kind of hang out and the teachers all kind of, it's sort of, it's much more like a group thing than it is like a one-on-one. Yeah, we did a lot of work to figure out what would work, and it has been just great thus far.
Sorry, since you mentioned the team, how do you train them for that?
Yeah, so I went to Ivory Coast, and it never occurred to me that I would bring people from the U.S. to go collect data because that just seemed very. I didn't have yet PhD students when I got the grant. So it was never the position I was starting from. So it was always like, okay, I assumed I would just build the equivalent of a lab with postdocs and senior and junior grad students and research assistants in Ivory Coast without that actually having like a lab space at a university. So I just started connecting with universities there. Anybody I met that was in the academic setting, just had meetings with them. I set up MOUs with 3 universities so that we would students would be able to work on my team and count as their internships, for instance, or co-supervision. So they would have a supervisor at the university and me, and so it was very transparent that what they were doing. And then I just went from there. Like I fly out a lot, spend a lot of time with them. We do training on like how to use equipment, training on the stats, and like paper writing, and like lots of stuff like that. We spend, but it's in some ways it's been much easier because they check me on things that I need to be checked on. Like I wanted to do a rapid digit naming, a rapid naming task. And so I was like, digit, I don't know about their numeracy skills, image, maybe the images are not so universal. So I'm like, let's do rapid color naming in the local language. And then the team looked at me like, this crazy. And they're like, we only have a color name for red and black. How are you going to do rapid color naming in this? I'm like, oh, so I think lots of things I would have been investing in trying to solve other problems. And instead I got to spend that time investing in training the students. So that was where that balance left.
Well, following up on that, and what kind of background your colleagues, the local partners had, like the students or faculty? Are they from linguistics background,
There's linguists. We've had, so I have a bunch of sociologists actually now. We've had some students from linguistics, some people have moved on to, they finished their degrees and then gone on to do other things, or they spent some time on their project and then moved on after some period. But I've had linguists, psychologists, sociologists, and psychology, and from the School of Education, and human rights and like sustainable development. I've had 2 students out of that group, and they've been really good. So they're also bringing like very different perspectives. and that's what makes this work. Questions?
Final question.
Oh, I'll ask.
Yeah, I think that was one of the lines when you were talking about the experience. And when the kids come and don't have experience, their delayed attendance or enrollment in school. And I'm curious, and if I know that the phones you are using were designed in Kenya.
No, the phone itself is like just a regular cheap phone that we buy for
Okay.
$10.
So I'm wondering, could it be how much of the definitely
Yeah.
they are not just coming to the school, to the class without they have some cultural experiences. I'm wondering, how does the content loaded in the phones,
Yeah.
how does that a little bit draw upon their own experience that is not captured in the English context?
Oh, that's a great question. So I don't have a great answer to that for this great question. We've been thinking a lot about how the kids use it, how the networks, the social networks around them support the usage, what they get out of it, what the parents feel about, do they feel like this is valuable? So we've been doing right now a lot of kind of qualitative work to understand this and understand how it fits within the child's life. But yeah, again, I think these are kind of bigger questions about how you just insert a piece of technology, which is new, right? Doing something on the phone for literacy it's not something these kids are already doing. So now we've just like inserted something else and had to make a compelling case, let's say to the parents, that there's value in adding this. And some of the things that we find is some parents are, yes, this is wonderful. Like I should have actually had a slide on this where we have some of the parent responses when we interview them about this. They really want the kid to use it. Some parents don't want the child using the phone unless the parent is present. Some parents, we found that if they have to go to the field and work for a week, they'll take the phone with them because they don't want to leave the phone alone in the house. So there's all these kind of other challenges that come in, but they speak to this question of how does it fit in within the rest of the social and cultural context. And I think this is still lots of important work left to do in this front. By comparison to the tablets, because we were kind of in contact with a group that was doing a tablet pilot. They wanted to it was just an epic fail. The tablets were just locked in a box in the classroom. They were never charged. It was this investment that went nowhere. And by comparison, like we actually have usage data. Like our kids are actually responding to this. They're phoning in. Like right now we have like 500 kids that are actively phoning, every few days to do this. So that indicates to us that we're heading in the right direction. But it still means that there's a lot of important work to be done to understand the social and cultural factors that shape the usage. Yeah.
For the sake of time, we're going to have to wrap up, but thank you so much, Dr. Jasinska. Yeah.